Good afternoon. My name is Monique King-Veland, and I'm the Director of State and Local Housing Policy at the Urban Institute. And I'd like to take a moment to introduce Urban. Urban is a nonprofit social and economic research institution, and our focus is on leveraging and sharing our data and research with changemakers to empower communities to develop contextualized solutions, policies, and programs that drive change, and particularly solutions aimed at equity, upward mobility, and racial justice. I'd also like to acknowledge the Wells Fargo Foundation for providing funding for this critically important work. In the case for reparations in the Atlantic, Ta-Nehisi Coates noted, from the 1930s through the 1960s, Black people across the country were largely cut out of the legitimate home mortgage market. And if you sought to advantage one group of Americans and disadvantage another, you could scarcely choose a more graceful method than housing discrimination. Housing discrimination is hard to detect, hard to prove, and hard to prosecute. Housing segregation is the weapon that mortally injures but does not bruise. The issue of racial equity and gaps in homeownership and wealth building are core areas of interest and research for us. Urban has been looking at the homeownership gaps as part of its housing work for many years. But in the recovery after the Great Recession, we became increasingly alarmed to see the Black homeownership rate in particular continuing to decline and not rebound, falling more than 5 percentage points. In 2018, the Black-white homeownership gap reached 30.5 percentage points, its highest level in 50 years. And overall, wealth disparities between Black, Latinx, and white households are also large. In 2019, the median Black household held 1/8 the wealth of the median white household, and the median Hispanic household held 1/5 the wealth of the median white household. Homeownership plays a bigger role in creating wealth for Black families than it does for white families. Housing equity makes up nearly 60% of total net worth for Black homeowners, compared with 43% of total net worth for white homeowners. And although homeownership should not be the only focus of public policy and wealth building for Black households, it is a solid foundation for building wealth that cannot be ignored. Racial disparities in homeownership and housing wealth are a result of current economic and demographic differences, and are a byproduct of past discriminatory housing policies and deliberate actions by multiple market players. The era of explicit discrimination in the housing market, implicit discrimination that continued even after the passage of the 1968 Fair Housing Act, the tight credit today that makes it hard for families of color to access mortgage markets, and the lack of affordable housing makes it harder for families of color to buy homes and build wealth. The legacy of housing discrimination lives on, and the injuries may not bruise, but they are clear in the disparities in the homeownership rate and the wealth gap we see today. But we believe in the power of partnership and the power of changemakers to forge a path forward with policies and programs informed by data and evidence that can make real progress towards closing the gap. And that's why we're so excited to be here this afternoon. So a few quick housekeeping items before we dive into the presentation and the panel. The event is being recorded, and the recording will be posted online afterwards. The speaker bios are available online at urban.org. We have closed captions turned on. If you'd like to adjust your settings, click the live transcription button at the bottom of your screen. And finally, all participants are muted, but we encourage you to send your questions or comments in the Q&A box at any time. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Lori Goodman, Vice President, Housing Finance Policy Center here at Urban, and June Zhu, non-resident fellow, Housing Policy Finance Center here at Urban. Lori and June.
Thanks very much, Monique. June is actually going to start this presentation.
Thank you all for this opportunity. We welcome any comments you have. Next slide, please. Before we go to any details, let me first take a look at what we found from this analysis. We look at both the household formation and home ownership in the future. The Headship will continue to drop for every age group through 2040. Let me put some numbers here. The net new household formation averaged 12.4 million per decade from 1990 to 2010. However, from 2030 to 2040, it will be 7.6 million. This means that there will be more people per household. We believe this because of the young adults living with their parents, and we have more single adults live with roommates or relatives. Plus, we actually have a slow pace of population growth due to the decline in immigration as well. Moreover, as you can see, all future net household growth will be from net non-white households. Increase in new households will always be among seniors, so it's reflecting the aging of the population. Our study also showed that the home ownership rate will continue to drop for most age groups through 2040. However, the aging of the population will mask the drop in the overall home ownership, as old households continue to have higher home ownership rates than the younger households. Overall, we project the home ownership rate will decline from 65% in 2020 to 62% by 2040. Next slide. Next slide, please. Now, let me talk about the method we used to do the projections. As shown in this chart, we define age group as the age of people born within 10-year span throughout the life cycle. We compute Headship rates and home ownership rates for each of the age group. Let me use 15 to 24 years old as an example. Those 15 to 24 years old group in 2020, they will transit into 25 to 34 age group in 2030. And you can imagine that they will become 35 to 44 age group in 2040. So we developed 3 different transition rate paths. The first occurred from 2000 to 2010, when financial crisis dramatically slowed down the household formation and home ownership attainment. The second occurs in 1990, which is considered as a fast transition. The third is based on adjustment to 2010 to 2018. Based on that, the minimum of this transition, we call it a slow scenario, and the maximum is called a fast scenario. Let me use home ownership rate as example. We use 2020 home ownership rate as the base, and then we add the transition rate. So we can get the home ownership rate in 2030. We repeat that procedure to get the 2040 projections as well. Now, next slide. So let me talk about household growth. What's gonna happen in the future? Household growth will be slow. If we focus just on the right-hand side bars, it shows the total 13.7 million new households formed between 1990 and 2000. 11.2 million new households formed between 2000 and 2010. How about the future? We estimate that 8.5 million new households will form between 2020 and 2030. 7.6 million more households will form between 2030 and 2040. Now, let's focus on the pink bars. The pink bars shows a change between 2030 and 2040. We know that in total, we expect 7.6 million net new households. However, let's break down by race. It represents 1.1 million net decrease in white households, 1.6 million net increase in Black households, 2.6 million net increase in other, basically Asian households, and also a 4.5 million net increase in Hispanic households. Now, you're probably going to ask why we have lower household growth. Next slide, please. So this chart shows the share of young adults living with their parents. For 2001, show as the blue bars. 2010, show as the yellow bars, and also 2018, show as the black bars. You can see that for all the races, the black bar is higher than the yellow bar, and the yellow bar is higher than the blue bar. What does this tell us? That is, over time, more young adults choose to stay with their parents longer. Let me give you some numbers here. Overall, the share who live with their parents increased from 10.6% in 2001 to 22% in 2018, doubled. And this sharp increase holds for all the race as well. Now, as we discussed, from 2020 to 2030, we have 8.5 million more total new households. Next slide, please. For 2020 to 2030, we have 8.5 million more total households. So take a look at this chart and focus on the yellow bars. What about those yellow bars? Yellow bars is from 2020 to 2030. And this is breakdown by age. And you can see a very high bar. And this high bar, the largest growth is expected to be in the 75 to 84 age group. And the second one, and followed by the 65 to 74 age group. And this basically reflects the fact that baby boomers were an order of the magnitude larger than the other generations. Now, let's do the math. From 2020 to 2030, there will be 8.5 million more total new households overall. However, if we focus on the seniors, there will be 9.6 million more senior households. So essentially, what we observe is that we have a net decrease in younger households, and the increase in the households age 65 and above is higher than the net household formation. Now, next slide, please. We know that population is aging. However, the age distribution differs by race. This chart shows the household composition by race. A blue blocks, if you focus on the blue blocks, they are the share of the white households. And for each year, we have two bars below 65 and above 65. Let's focus on the middle bars for 2020 in the middle. What you can see is that white households are much older than Hispanics, Blacks, and Asian and other households. 62% of the people younger than 65 were whites. 78% of the people 65 and older were whites. How about future? Now take a look at the bars towards the right and focus on those under 65. The non-white composition of the younger group will rise faster than that for the old group. By 2040, we project that the younger group will be 52.6% white, and the old group will be 69.4% white. Next slide, please. Now, I will switch to Lori for home ownership results.
Thank you very much. This shows you the homeownership rates by race for 2020, and you can see there's a huge difference by race ethnicity. So, for example, the white homeownership gap, the white homeownership rate in 2020 was 73% versus 41.9% for Blacks, 49% for Hispanics, 58.1% for Asians and others, and the total was 64.7%, as June had told you in the summary. Now let's actually look at what's happened from 2000 to 2020, and then look at our projections from 2020 to 2040. You can see from 2000 to 2020, there was a small increase in the white homeownership rate, a large decrease of 4.4% in the Black homeownership rate, and an increase in the Hispanic homeownership rate of 3.3%, and an increase in the Asian and other homeownership rate of 5.1%. Now, if you look sort of for the next 20 years, we're actually projecting a decline in the white and Black homeownership rate on the order of about 1.5%, an increase in the Hispanic homeownership rate of 2.4%, a small drop in the homeownership rate for Asians and others, and a somewhat larger drop of 2.5% in the overall homeownership rate, reflecting the increased diversity in terms of race ethnicity. The reason the Hispanic homeownership rate increases, whereas everyone else's decrease, is that so many of the Hispanics are at that age where they're just moving into their prime homeownership, where their prime home buying years. They're just plain younger than the other groups. And that accounts for the increase in the homeownership rate. They're on that very steep part of the age trajectory. Next slide, please. This slide shows you the homeownership rates by age group in 2020. And you can see the less than 44-year-old age group, 46.5%, 45 to 64, 72.3%, 65 plus, 78.4% for your total of 64.7%. So you can see the rise in the homeownership as you age. If we had actually broken this down into 10-year intervals, you would find the homeownership rate actually peaks between 75 and 84. And for 85-year-olds and over, it actually declines somewhat. Now let's look at the change in the homeownership rate from 2000 to 2020. You can see the less than or equal to 45 and 44-year-olds and younger actually had a huge decline in the homeownership rate of 6.3%. Whereas 45 to 64, 4.6%, and the 65-year-olds and older actually had their homeownership rate increase. Remember, these younger age groups were disproportionately hit by the great financial crisis. Now let's look at what we expect from 2020 to 2040. We expect basically the youngest age group, the less than or equal to 44-year-olds, to be pretty flat. A huge decline in the 45 to 64-year-old age group, a large decline in the 65 plus, for a total decline of around 2.5%. So, from 2020 to 2040, we expect that the groups that fail to get on the rung of homeownership will continue to be impacted as they move through their life. Next slide, please. This shows you the homeownership rates for ages 45 to 64 by race ethnicity. You can see the white homeownership rate in 2020 was 79.7%, 49% for Blacks, 59% for Hispanics, 71.3% for Asians and others, for a total homeownership rate in that group of 72.3%. Now let's break this down in terms of what's happened from 2000 to 2020 and 2020 to 2040. So again, we see the huge racial ethnic disparities. But when you break this down by race ethnicity, for this age group, it's particularly frightening. What you see is from 2000 to 2020, the decline in the 45 to 64-year-old homeowners for whites was 2.1%, Blacks 8.9%, Hispanics up by 0.3%, and Asians and others up by 3.7%. Going forward, we actually see every group losing homeownership rate for this age group. However, the decline in the Black homeownership rate for 45 to 64-year-olds at 6.3% is much larger than the other groups, and means that more and more Black Americans are going to enter their retirement not owning a home. And this is truly frightening. So next slide, please. Part of the reason for the sharp drop in the homeownership rate is marriage rates, and you can see how much marriage rates have dropped since 1990, from 70% to about 58.8%. And again, that is marriage is one of the largest contributors to homeownership, and certainly the decreasing marriage rate means that there are going to be it means a decline in the homeownership rate. Next slide, please. There were a lot of Blacks and Hispanics who lost their home in the wake of the great financial crisis. There were a lot of people that lost their homes. Those home losses were disproportionately Black and Hispanic. And the reason that one of the reasons that those homeownership rates have been so slow to come back, and in some cases have continued to decline, is a reliance on credit scores. Credit scores have been shown to be the best predictor in terms of default performance, although they're not measured absolutely correctly. And you can see how badly Blacks are disadvantaged by this. The percentage of whites with above a 700 credit score is 57.5%. It's 25.7% for Blacks, about 37% for Hispanics, and 69% for Asians. So certainly that has explained one of the reasons why it's been so difficult for Blacks to access homeownership in the period from 2010 to 2020, and we expect that trend to continue. One very important note: FICO scores do not take into account on-time rental payments or payment of telecom and utility bills, which for many people are one of the ways they show their creditworthy. Next slide, please. This shows homeownership rates for the total population by age cohort. So you can see the homeownership rate for the younger boomers in blue, those born 1956 to 65, at every age. So you can see their homeownership rate at 25 to 34 was about 45%, and it continued to increase. You can also see the homeownership rate for Gen X in the orange line, those born 66 to 75. For older millennials, those born 76 to 85 is the black line, and the gray line is that for younger millennials born 1986 to 95. What you see here is that for every age group is tracking below the homeownership rate of previous age groups at the same age. So again, this is the total population. Next slide, please. And this slide breaks it down by race ethnicity. You can see for white households, the pattern is clear, although the differentiation is fairly muted. Each 10-year group is doing a little worse than the group before it. For homeownership rates for Blacks, you can see a much larger gap by 10-year increments. So younger boomers are doing way better than Gen X, who are doing way better than older millennials, who are doing a little better than the younger millennials. For Hispanics and Asians, there's much smaller differentiations, although there are differentiations. So next slide, please. What does all this mean? We figure if younger generations, that is everyone born after 1965, bought at the rate of young boomers, that is those born 56 to 65, then we would have 3.3 million more homeowners. However, the effects are very different across race ethnicities. There would be about 3.5% more white homeowners there would be about 12.4% more Black homeowners, a small number of additional Hispanic homeowners, about 4.1% additional Asian and other homeowners, for a total of 3.8% increase in the number of homeowners. So bottom line, if younger generation, if everyone born after 1965 had bought, if all Blacks born after 1965 had bought at the same rate of those as those born 56 to 65, you would have 12.4 million Black homeowners. The numbers for other racial and ethnic groups are the differential is much, much lower. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to turn to looking at the projections on the absolute number of homeowners and renters and the implication. We're projecting from 2020 to 2040, there's going to be 6.9% additional new homeowners. That represents a 1.8% contraction in the number of 1.8 million fewer white households, fewer white homeowners, 1.2 million additional Black homeowners, 4.8% additional Hispanic homeowners, and 2.7 additional Asian and other homeowners. If you want to look at this contribution in terms of percent, you can see that Hispanics are going to account for almost 70% of the growth in the number of homeowners. Asians and others about 39%, Blacks about 17%, and whites constitute a 26% decline. So again, change in the number of homeowners is going to be entirely driven by communities of color, with Hispanics leading the way. Next slide, please. We are going to need to support 5.5 million more senior renters by 2040. So if you look at the top part of this slide, this shows you the number of millions of senior households, period. And sort of from 2000 to 2020, we added about 4 million additional senior households per decade. From 2020 to 2040, we're going to add about 6.9 million additional households per decade, courtesy of the fact that the boomers are just an order of magnitude larger than the silent generation that came before them. More than half of the growth in the senior household formation is going to be non-white. So we're going to have about 13.8 million new senior households. Compound this 13.8 million senior households with a drop in the home ownership rate, and you get a lot of additional senior renters. In particular, we expect the number of senior renters to rise from 7.4 million in 2020 to 12.9 million by 2040. When you look at the growth in the senior renter population in the bottom of this picture, you can see that in the total growth in the senior renter population is going to be about 75%. We expect the number of senior white renters to grow by 51%. The number of senior Black renters to grow by 103%. The growth in the number of senior Hispanic renters to grow by 155%. And Asian and other senior renters, we expect a growth rate of 95%. So that's sort of the high-level summary of our national results. With that, I'm going to turn it back to June to talk about our state-level results, and then I'm going to finish up with the conclusions.
Thank you, Lori. Now, let me first do an advertisement. Please check out our state-level projection website. This is a very interesting and useful tool. When you click the map, any state, you can see the detailed trends and forecasts for household formation and home ownership. Next slide, please. Here is an example. If you click the map for California, this shows the household formation and home ownership in California. And for more details, we look at the trends by age, ethnicities, lot of useful information for you to use. Now, next slide, please. We dive deeper into different states and find very interesting results. So let me give you some punchlines from our state level analysis. First, the change in the households and home ownership composition will look very differently across states. Let me use 4 states as an example. Texas has the highest share of the Hispanic families in the nation. Georgia is the second one. It has the highest share of Black families. California has the highest share of the families of the Asian and other households. And California is also the second highest share of the Hispanic households. How about Minnesota? Minnesota has mostly white households. So if you focus on the black bar on the left, you can see Texas stand out, and it will has a higher growth in the Hispanic households in the future. And you probably say, well, if you look at California, California's black bar is also expanding. However, for the California, I would like you to focus on the top, which is a yellow bar. This represents the Asia and other households. By 2040, 22% of the California households would be Asia and other races. Now, let's take a look at the Blacks. Blacks are indicated by the blue bar, and we can see a big chunk is from Georgia. Georgia is a fast growth state with a large share of the Black households and steep increase in the Asia and the Black home ownership. Now, let's take a look at Minnesota. Huge chunk of the pink bar, right? And you can see the pink bar represents the white share. In the future, Minnesota will be a state with increasing racial ethnicity diversity, and we will expect a narrow white and Black home ownership gap. Next slide, please. Go up. All right, so I think this is for the state level. Lori will give you some policy implications from our analysis.
Yes. So I think there's a number of implications for the analysis. First, next slide, please. To support the large number of senior households, we need to urgently focus on developing and implementing policies that address their specific needs. For senior renters, we need more supportive housing, increased use of the Section 202 program, which basically allows nonprofits to finance the construction, rehabilitation, and acquisition of structures that will be supportive housing, and also provide subsidies for the projects to make them affordable, rent subsidies to make them affordable, increased use of the low-income housing tax credit and housing choice vouchers. For senior homeowners, we need to make the reverse mortgage program more flexible, which will allow them to age in place as long as possible. That means simplifying design, lowering the costs of the product, and improving reverse mortgage literacy so senior homeowners can adequately assess whether reverse mortgage is right for them. We have to prepare for the surge of renters and the coming demographic changes by increasing the supply of affordable housing. That means making zoning and land use much more flexible to promote multifamily housing, to speed up the permitting process to allow developers to move forward with affordable rental and condo construction. With most of the increase in homeowners coming from the Hispanic and Asian and other communities who are more apt to live in multi-generational housing than their white counterparts, zoning needs to permit this type of housing. We need to relax regulations to allow for accessory dwelling units. and encourage systems to match roommates, renters, and boarders with seniors who could use both the help paying the rent and the help period. We need to expand zoning to allow for manufactured homes and updates the zoning and building codes to allow for more modular and panelized construction in those areas where it's not permitted. We also need to take fairly major action to close the homeownership gap. And in particular, there are three classes of things we need to do. We need to improve and expand financial education and homeownership preparation and increase the visibility, access, and types of down payment assistance programs. This is actually this is actually a game changer. Particular homeownership preparation and down payment assistance are very important tools to close the racial homeownership gap. Parental wealth and family history of homeownership are highly correlated with a person's likelihood of owning a home. Accordingly, Black and Hispanic homeowners without the advantage of parental support may benefit from targeted assistance in homeownership counseling and down payment assistance. First-time home buyers oftentimes buy fixer-uppers and rehab financing is tight. Condo rules are much more restrictive than they used to be, than they need to be, and community land trusts and responsible lease to purchase arrangements are alternative paths to home ownership, but financing difficulties oftentimes limit accessibility. We need to rethink two of the three measures we use to qualify for mortgage credit: traditional DTI and also credit scores. Traditional DTI requires consistent income for a 2-year period, and many workers who are fully or partially self-employed lack this income history. There's also a reluctance to count the income of borrowers who are not on the mortgage but contribute to it, which affects multi-generational households, as well as those living with partners or roommates. A more robust underwriting system would give more credit for these contributions. We need to incorporate alternative credit data in credit scoring models and use technology to responsibly expand access to credit. We saw that Black and Hispanic borrowers have lower credit scores than white borrowers, and 1 in 10 adults don't have a credit score at all. We need to figure out how to count rental payment history, which is usually not reported to the credit bureaus, as well as telecom, utility, and cable payment data. We need to do this. We need to figure out how to access bank statements. And finally, we have to sustain home ownership for households with low wealth who are disproportionately people of color. Perhaps considering financial reserves are a key determinant of a borrower's ability to sustain a mortgage, and perhaps thinking in terms of mortgage products that require a lower down payment, but the borrower keeps reserves or a reserve fund. We need to think about more streamlined and flexible options for mortgage loss mitigation. And a streamlined refi program would also help, as most refinancings go to higher credit score borrowers. So, so basically, I think the numbers tell the story. And at this point, the numbers are very, very compelling. Policy action is needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lori.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, June. This was really great. Wow, this was an incredibly insightful presentation. One thing that sort of struck me was the projected decline in the homeownership rate for Black households headed by 45 to 74-year-olds. And it made me think that if we continue with the current policies and sort of as is status quo, the Black homeownership rate then is going to continue to fall and will be lower than it has been for previous generations at the same age. And also that sort of unprecedented impact that's going to have in terms of the number of renters who are African-American over the age of 65. Listening to you all, I felt sort of equal parts upsetting and also staggering, just thinking about the data. And honestly, I suspect the findings struck not just me, but this amazing panel that we're going to have as well. And I'm even more excited now to moderate this discussion and hear their thoughts. So I want to take a moment to introduce the panel, and they will turn on their cameras. Leanne Adams is joining us. She's the Senior Vice President for National Initiatives at NeighborWorks America. Debbie Goldberg is the Vice President of Housing Policy and Special Projects, the National Fair Housing Alliance. Norena Limon is Executive Vice President of Public Policy and Industry Relations at the National Association of Hispanic Real Estate Professionals. Kimberly Smith-Moore is Senior Vice President, Social Impact Homeownership Lead, Housing Affordability Philanthropy Team, that's a mouthful, at Wells Fargo Foundation. And certainly last but certainly not least, Stockton Williams, Executive Director of the National Council of State Housing Agencies. Thank you so much for the panel for joining me this afternoon. I want to start by asking each of the panelists actually to take a few moments and to sort of reflect on what about the projection struck you as most surprising or significant. And Leanne, if you don't mind, let's start with you.
Yeah, and thank you, Monique. And I think, your observations I share as well, and it really bears repeating. It's the data lays out in stark reality, the kind of projected decrease in the Black homeownership rate. And we've seen that kind of ongoing. And I think that laid out with the FICO scores and the differences across race and ethnicity, they really present a reality we all know, but you can't really avoid. And so I appreciate all of the policy implications that have been laid out. And I think more than just putting more resources towards the challenge, we really need to look at removing some systemic barriers and structural barriers that are keeping minority homeowners, and particularly Black households, Black people, from achieving homeownership. So I'm looking forward to discussing the policy implications.
Thanks, Leanne. Debbie, how about you?
So I want to start just by saying thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation, and congratulations to the Urban team on this research, which I think is really helpful and going to really help steer a conversation in the right direction. And like Leanne, I think my key takeaways were similar to yours, that the net decrease in white home ownership, the fact that essentially all new homeowners are going to be households of color, and in particular Latino households, and then the net loss of Black home ownership, which is a direction we do not want to be going in. I think that's exactly the wrong direction for us to be going if we're looking to achieve better equity in this country, a more equitable distribution of home ownership and of wealth. And I guess, one thing that really struck me from listening to all of those findings was how misaligned I think our mortgage finance system is with the needs of our future home buyers, right? I think we have a mortgage finance system that was built, really, to be blunt, largely for white households. If you want to be even more blunt, for white, middle class, kind of middle management, white collar, and probably male household, or male-headed households, right? And that's not who, we've made tweaks over the years, right? I want to give some credit where it's due, but I don't think we're where we need to be to serve the home buyers of the future. So we have a lot of work to do.
Thanks, Debbie. Norena?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for hosting this roundtable, and thank you so much for the amazing research. We've been quoting you all constantly over the past week. We just had our conference and released our State of Hispanic Homeownership report. And one of the things that struck us is that we've been saying this for a while. We've been saying, Latinos are the future of the housing market. Look at the numbers. Is our environment conducive to the fact that Latinos are the future of the housing market? And being able to quantify it with an actual projection that Latinos will make up 70% of new homeowners over the next 20 years is absolutely astounding. And I think more than even just bridging the homeownership gap between white and communities of color, it's the fact that if we value homeownership as a public good for the country and all of the things that come with homeownership, stimulating a recessive economy, taxes, stability, health outcomes, educational outcomes, then we're really looking at a lower homeownership rate for the country. So we really need to ensure that the system is conducive to account for the demand of new homeowners coming forward in the next 20 years. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Kimberly?
Hi, Monique. So I just want to start out by really taking a moment to thanking the Urban Institute and recognizing you guys and the importance of this work that you're doing in the data. I mean, it's really helping to motivate conversations with change makers. And I really, at Wells Fargo, we really truly appreciate it. Motivating conversations, addressing homeownership disparities, really striving for equality, especially in the BIPOC communities. And building wealth through homeownership for us is truly important. But one of the things really that I saw here is the data and the change of the number of future homeowners. And then when you layered that with age and also race, those things really stood out. In addition to the FICO score, you know, I saw that in another presentation that you did a few months ago, and that really stood out for me because, you know, we're rewarding people who've established credit, but we're penalizing those that haven't fallen into the model, right, of establishing credit, and maybe they pay their bills. That's where the alternative credit and things really, I think, will play an important role, because we really have to do something and work together to really address the decline that's projected to happen. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. And Stockton, things that were surprising and struck you.
Well, thanks very much, Monique, and congratulations once again to the Urban Institute for putting together such a terrific presentation. You know, there's 540 some odd participants on this call, which is pretty amazing given the subject matter and everything else going on. I think for me, the presentation is a twofold call for a moral imperative and a business opportunity. And for state housing finance agencies and many others on the call, these two things are inextricably linked. And there's a real need, and there is a sense of urgency to try to bridge this horrendous homeownership gap between whites and Blacks and Hispanics. And if you don't do that, you're not going to succeed in our business, because as the data makes clear, that's where the market opportunity as well as the moral imperative is. I would say the thing that was most striking to me was actually some historical context early in the presentation that reminded us that the housing fallout from the Great Recession 10 years ago was disproportionately felt by households and communities of color. We're not in nearly as adverse a housing market today, but we know there's enormous stress on both renters and homeowners, especially those of color. And so as new federal tools like the Homeowner Assistance Fund, which I'm sure we'll talk about, start to come online, it's going to be incredibly important that we don't lose further ground and create wider gaps in the racial homeownership gap that we're dealing with.
Thank you, Stockton. I like that framing, both a moral imperative and a business opportunity. Perhaps if we can't bring people along one way, we can bring them along another, if we think about it from that perspective. Debbie, I want to go back to you and the point you made about sort of the misalignment in the system. You know, when we talk about these projections, you know, I wonder, do people think they're sort of inevitable? Or is there an opportunity to sort of change the trajectory, to do some course correction? So I'm wondering, do you see these projections as inevitable, or is there a way to address that misalignment to make a change in terms of where we're headed?
So that's a great question. And I would say, I don't think it has to be inevitable, but that's not to say that it would be easy, right, to change those projections. And I want to pick up on Stockton's point about looking at history, but I think we need to go back farther than the Great Recession to understand the history of our country and how we came to be, or came to this point where we have such disparities, not only in homeownership rates by race and ethnicity, but also in wealth and in so many other things, right? We are operating in a landscape that is highly inequitable, I think is the word that I'm searching for there, based on race. And it's the result of, you know, a long series of very deliberate actions that were taken, right, to create that kind of a system, that kind of a landscape. And so, you know, those were policies and actions taken by government at all levels, as well as by many different players in the private sector. And so if we want to change course and change that directory, I think we also have to be very deliberate about the range of actions that will be needed to accomplish that. I think it's very possible, but there's a lot of work involved. And we do have to be very deliberate. And some of it, I think, will be somewhat uncomfortable, right? Because we get into kind of our little ruts, right? We get used to doing business a certain way and assume that that's the best way to do business. And I think we have to challenge a lot of our assumptions. I would just say really quickly, I think we have to recalibrate our mortgage finance system. We have to set different goals, and we have to have different tools that we use. I think the recommendations that Lori was laying out get at what some of those might be. And I think then we also have to intervene to address some of the inequities that have built up. And just a couple of things I would throw out are down payment assistance, right? I think we need some new models of down payment assistance, which hopefully we can talk about more. We have been at the National Fair Housing Alliance also looking at a vehicle called special purpose credit programs, which allow lenders and others to create programs that really enable people who couldn't qualify for credit or could qualify on less favorable terms to get their foot in the door on terms that will work for them. And one other piece that I would throw out is I think we also need to pay attention to the needs of people who are not proficient English speakers, because navigating the mortgage finance system, if you are not proficient in English, is not only difficult, but really fraught, right? There are a lot of danger points there. And I don't think we've done nearly as much as we can or need to do in helping people who want to become homeowners or want to keep their homes, but have trouble navigating those systems in English.
Thank you, Debbie. I think there's a great George Santayana quote about if you don't acknowledge history, you're sort of doomed to repeat it. And I thought about that, I think, in your comments. So shifting gears a little bit and talking about models, right? Leanne, I want to go to you and then also to Stockton and others. Feel free to jump in as well. But Leanne, have you seen some successful models, sort of to Debbie's point, either locally or nationally, that are effectively addressing the homeownership gap?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So NeighborWorks works through a network of about 245 local organizations across the country, and we've seen a few different things be really successful. And really, we're thinking about a broad continuum of serving consumers and potential homeowners, starting with people who may be renters and not even thinking about homeownership, and really supporting them through financial coaching, looking at alternative credit, building that credit history. There are some models out there for credit reporting, for on-time rent reporting that are, pretty exciting. And then moving into pre-purchase counseling, we appreciate the study and the recommendations kind of calling out that education and counseling, but that is an important investment prior to even homebuyer education to prepare someone for home ownership and get them ready. And then Debbie brought up down payment assistance. This has been a really effective tool deployed across our network through our partnership with Wells Fargo over the last 9 years. I think we've put out over $330 million in down payment assistance and created almost 25,000 new homeowners. Over 60% of those people are minorities, and about 60% or 80% are below AMI. And so these are, I think this is the group that we want to be working with, but we need to continue to invest in this and scale this and be intentional. And then two other areas I think I would highlight. One is the power of investing in community development financial institutions. Increased investment there. Those are local institutions in the communities. They have local partnerships. They have trust in their communities. They understand their needs. So having those kinds of relationships locally in the community are really important to bridge that trust and bring people in. And then lastly, I was excited to hear Lori bring up, we're in an affordable housing crisis. The supply issues are real right now. And so as we think about creating new homeowners, we have to also think about the supply challenges, affordable supply challenges. And so we're starting to see in some markets increasing interest in kind of land trust, different shared equity models. And so it's not for every market, we realize that, but it is a way to get people into homeownership and build some wealth that can put them on a path forward. So those are a few of the models that we've seen be successful across our network.
Thanks, Leanne. Stockton, I was hoping based on your membership too, you might be able to speak to some successful models that maybe your members are operationalizing nationally.
Well, I think Leanne did a terrific job of really summarizing a suite of approaches that all have to be undertaken and are. And would just say a couple of things from the State Housing Finance Agency's perspective. One, when you look at down payment assistance, there really is a delivery system consisting of housing finance agencies, NeighborWorks affiliates, CDFIs, and others that is pretty scalable. It's got wide penetration into the market. It's very much focused on Black and brown people and places, as well as others who are underserved by conventional products. It needs more resources. And so it's encouraging to see there's discussion in Congress and within the administration about some options to put more dollars into that delivery system, or delivery systems really, of HFAs and NeighborWorks affiliates, CDFIs, community-based groups, and others. So that actually feels like part of this puzzle of a problem that's somewhat solvable in the near term. In terms of the supply, though, that one is harder, and some housing finance agency efforts that are really trying to push the envelope out on this that I think are hopefully models for others to consider would be two. In Massachusetts, there's a Commonwealth builder program that the Massachusetts Housing Finance Agency and others are actively going into predominantly communities of color and trying to create new housing that would not only be made available at affordable prices to buyers in those communities, but also serve as an opportunity for builders and developers and others in the industry who are of color. So it's about wealth appreciation, wealth acquisition and appreciation, and also business development opportunity, and try to sort of join those all together in a place-based way. On the other side, and it's important when we talk about supply to talk about adding, but also not losing, I would highlight Convergence Memphis, which is a partnership between the Tennessee Housing Development Authority and many other private and community-based organizations that's aiming to stabilize and then ultimately strengthen Black neighborhoods in Memphis that prior to the Great Recession were actually showing an upswing in homeownership. But it turned out a lot of it was being driven by shady practices, shoddy financial products. And so now, after one step forward, it's been several steps back. Well, there, a lot of the emphasis is on existing homes, how you can rehab and repair the existing housing stock, which can be a lot more cost effective. And we need to make sure, particularly as we're looking at particular communities, that we're not losing housing stock to obsolescence or gentrification. At the same time, we're sort of trying to chip away at new solutions to add to it. So we've got to build new, and then we've also got to preserve what we have, especially where it's been decent, affordable home ownership housing for people of color.
Thank you, Stockton. So I'm thinking about, Lori had some policy recommendations. Leanne mentioned some things, Stockton mentioned some things. I want to turn to you, Narena. I mean, part of the problem is if we had all the resources, we want to do everything, right? To sort of attack the issue, but we have to be a little bit more targeted, right? So I'm curious from your perspective, where do you see the sort of greatest need for intervention? Who should be leading that effort? Is it a private sector role, a public sector role, nonprofits, a combination? Sort of how do we get at this in a targeted way?
Sure, thank you. Well, I wanted to highlight that the statistics that Latinos are predicted to make up 70% of new households over the next 20 years. I wanted to highlight that that's a prediction based on demand. The demand for home ownership is there within the Latino community, but housing inventory and the gap between the demand and the supply of housing, as stated before, remains the biggest obstacle for Latinos. We're seeing out in the market auction wars happening right now with with all contingencies removed. Where we talk about down payment assistance, but first-time home buyers with down payment assistance have no shot at getting a house where 15 other people are bidding for that same house, oftentimes competing with cash buyers. So we look at, in our report, we found that there are 8.3 million Latinos under 45 that are considered mortgage ready, that aren't homeowners. So that tells you right there that for Latinos, probably the affordable housing crisis is probably the biggest barrier. There's a lot of ways that we can that we can address this issue, and I think it's a matter of everybody coming together, because it is such a complicated and multifaceted issue in terms of addressing the construction needs of new housing. We believe that the infrastructure bill that's being debated right now, the American Jobs Plan, has a lot of housing as infrastructure commitments in there that could help. Lori mentioned zoning reform. We found that there's about 75% of residential neighborhoods in the country are zoned for single family housing. So we need to do something about zoning reform, but there's also another critical component, which is there's a construction labor shortage. And there is a direct correlation between our comprehensive immigration reform and labor supply that we need to address. And as an industry, we need to come together and really think about that, because that is a way that we can address some of the high cost of producing new homes. So multifaceted federal approach, also a local city by city state approach on rezoning land to make land more conducive to more density and to ensure that we lower the cost of housing. And then I can go on forever and ever about the new definition of CFPB, of the qualified mortgage at CFPB. And there's when it comes to access to credit, we talked about down payment assistance for first generational households. A lot we can do, but I would say housing inventory is probably the #1 thing that we need to all address.
So it sounds like there are two things I'm sort of hearing: structural barriers on the financing side, but there's also significant barriers on the supply side, right?
Yes.
So let's stay with supply for a minute. I'd ask any of you, what are your thoughts? And Stockton raised some of these initially on how are we addressing large scale the supply issue. I know during my time working in Los Angeles, California, just in Southern California alone, we had a deficit of 500,000 affordable units. And we're talking mostly on the renter side. We weren't even bridging on the homeownership side, right? So how are you addressing supply at scale? Any thoughts on that? Maybe Debbie, do you have any thoughts? Or Stockton, would you like to add any additional thoughts around that as well?
Well, maybe let me defer to Stockton for a minute, because we're not in the housing construction business. I do have some thoughts I want to add, but it's not probably central to that point. So let Stockton go first, if that's okay.
Go ahead, Stockton.
Remember the starter home, the entry level home, you might have called it? In the 70s and 80s, the home building industry in America was producing 420,000 entry level or starter homes a year. Last year, 60,000 maybe, according to the National Association of Home Builders. The industry is no longer able, with some exceptions, to produce that kind of entry level home, except in pretty far-flung exurban areas, or with subsidy and all kinds of creative financing in closer in more suburban and urban markets. You'd think that in this country that is well known for being so innovative in so many industries, this would have been cracked by now, but it hasn't. There are a lot of people working on it in home building and construction and technology, and you hear about 3D printed homes and new iterations on old ideas like prefab and modular housing. And there are some really exciting concepts and companies, but it's all happening pretty slowly. Yes, the zoning and NIMBY issues are real at the local level, but housing finance agencies don't believe that even if you could wave a magic wand and get rid of most of them, that you would all of a sudden see a lot more production at the price point you really need it, which is 150,000, 175,000 all in, to be able to put something on the market that the people who we're talking about in this presentation really need to be able to afford. That's going to require public subsidy. And so legislation like the infrastructure bill is going to be an incredibly important opportunity to try to get some additional resources in to bridge that gap between what even the most ingenious builder can do to put something on the market, and what the buyers and the coming buyers can afford.
Thank you.
So if I can jump back in, I would just add to Stockton's point. I think there's a need for real leadership at the federal level. I feel like in my career working on housing issues for a while here now, we haven't ever really had in this country a comprehensive housing policy. And that's something that we need. And we need that at the federal level. And then I think we need that at the state and local level as well. And, in addition to eliminating unnecessary barriers and providing subsidies where those are needed, I also think we need to look at making sure that the housing stock that we're creating matches up with the needs of the households who are looking for housing at all. We've talked about quite a range of households here, right? Newly formed households, multi-generational households, senior households who may have their own particular needs. So we need to make sure we're not just creating housing, right? Not all housing is going to equally well serve the needs of our population. We need to have a strategy that matches up those needs with the supply that we're creating. And then I think it's also really important for us to be looking at not just the homes that we're building, but where they are, who gets access to them, and whether all of our communities are equally well resourced, right? Are they all places where everybody would want to live? And what are the neighborhoods that we have disinvested from over the years that lack some of the really important elements of a healthy neighborhood, whether that's access to stores that sell healthy food, whether that's good transportation, good schools, recreational opportunities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think if we really want to serve the needs of our population going forward, we need to make sure that those kinds of resources and amenities are equitably distributed in our communities as well. And if we don't do that, then we're not really going to get to the place where we want to be.
Thank you, Debbie. So we've heard a lot about the barriers on the financial side. We've talked about FICO score, we've talked about down payments, and also, frankly, the supply issue has created such demand on the market that I'm seeing not 15 different people bidding on a house, but I read an article in the Washington Post about 76 people bidding on a house and all cash offers and that sort of thing in the market, right? But despite all these barriers to access, one of the other things that struck me during the presentation is that homeownership still remains a primary source of wealth building, particularly for African Americans, almost disproportionately so, right, when compared to white families. And so, Kimberly, I wanted to see if you could weigh in a little bit. Given the barriers, I just wonder if you have any thoughts on just other opportunities or other sources that we should be shifting towards thinking about around wealth building. So is that retirement? Is that investments? Is that entrepreneurship? I mean, what could that look like for communities of color?
Yeah, great question, Monique. And I really, I just want to say thank you for the panelists. Lots of great information, and I hope the attendees are absorbing this, because I've been taking notes on it, because you guys are all making some great points, and it also helps to validate a lot of the thinking that we've been doing here at Wells Fargo, based on the data and based on things that we've heard. So thank you for that. I do I just make a couple points on Stockton. You're saying the scalability, and yeah, we've been doing a down payment assistance program with NeighborWorks America for many years. And, I've always encouraged others to do it because it's going to take dollars. Providing down payment assistance, which we know is one of the biggest barriers in achieving home ownership. So the more dollars that we can get out there for down payment assistance programs definitely would be better. Debbie, I hear what you're saying. We need help at the federal level. And so, that's an opportunity of possibly where those dollars could come from. But, there was a Forbes study, and it says the three main sources of wealth, creating wealth, are the stock market, right? Real estate and entrepreneurship, right? And I kind of looked at those, as far as for me, in the Black community, right? And, real estate really stood out. And I really do believe that home ownership remains the cornerstone of the American dream. And also it helps build strong communities because that's what we're all striving for. And in addition, drives the US economy, right? When you have a homeowner, it creates taxes and it does things for the community in general. So I really still think that really, as your data is showing, is really the primary wealth for in particularly communities of color. So that's very important. I know Leanne talked about the Neighborhood Lift program. We've been doing that with NeighborWorks since 2012. But one thing I think is interesting is when we started Neighborhood Lift in 2012, it was to address the foreclosure crisis, right? We were just coming out of that, right? And there were conversations with our executive leadership, and in particular, it was head of Urban League, and they said, hey, Wells Fargo, you guys are doing great things to keeping people in homes that you service the mortgage on, right? Because we did these home preservation workshops, right? And so then we pivoted into thinking, okay, what can we do to create homeowners? And that's really how Neighborhood Lift started. It was out of the foreclosure crisis. But then I kind of look at now, we're in a new crisis here, right? We've gotten past the foreclosure crisis, then it's like another crisis and another crisis is coming. But I think it kind of goes back to what Debbie was saying, that we really never addressed those underlying issues that have happened from years ago around policies, intentional policies to prohibit people of color, and particularly African Americans, from achieving Black ownership. That's where we need to start. That's where we need to go, right? And so, and that's why I think the work that you're doing, as I stated earlier, is so important, because now, we're at a turning point right now with all these disparities and the racial inequalities and things that are happening. It's time to do something. Look at your data, because if we don't change this trajectory, it's gonna be a reality. And we really need to come together as change makers to really move the needle on that. I can say, at Wells Fargo, Leanne provided the information about the data and the number of homeowners created. And so, that program, we're going to continue that program. It is in 2 markets currently, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and also the Bay Area. We're looking to continue it in 2021. But in addition to that, our sales team launched recently a few initiatives to increase homeownership in select markets. It's the Dream Plan Home Initiative. Go on the website, get more information. There's 2 initiatives or 2 products under that. It's a closing cost initiative, getting up to 5% towards the closing cost. And then there's another mortgage product that you can put at least 3% down, right? Because there's a lot of myths out there around home ownership, right? That you need a large down payment, 10, 20% down, but there are those programs that don't require that. So I think it's all a part of counsel. We need to educate people and also counsel them. I know Lori, I keep saying Lori because I work with the Lori at NeighborWorks, but Leanne, through NeighborWorks, we worked on an initiative through Neighborhood Lift, a counseling initiative that really works with meeting potential home buyers where they are and working with them to build their credit so they can become potential homeowners. So I'll stop there. I know I said a lot, very passionate about the work that I do, but again, thank you, Urban Institute, for all the work that you do and all the panelists.
Thank you. So it sounds like homeownership is still the thing, but there's a lot of barriers, both on the supply side, on the financing side, that need to be addressed. I want to transition to audience Q&A because there's already a host of questions in the Q&A box, but I also just want to say, again, if we had a bevy of resources, we could do everything, right? But that's never the case. So I want to give each of the panelists 30 seconds. If you had to pick one thing that you would pick as a recommendation that you think would have the most impact and is the most critical thing at this point, what would it be? 30 seconds. Leanne, we'll start with you.
I feel like we've said a lot about down payment assistance, so I'm going to go in the direction of really investing in counseling. So really investing in the work that happens on the front end to coach and prepare, to work on credit scores, to set goals so that prospective homeowners can be ready and prepared to be for affordable and sustainable home ownership. So I'd say counseling is really, really important and a broad investment in that.
Okay. Debbie, what about you? 30 seconds.
So I'm going to go in a policy direction here and say that I think we need to really establish policies across our housing finance system, or more broadly across our housing system, that guide us in the direction of greater equity. We've got a beginning of that in this administration, which I think is really good, but we need to figure out what that means in practical terms. And then we need to pair that with really effective both monitoring and enforcement. One of the things we haven't talked about here yet is our civil rights laws and our failure to really do a good job of enforcing them, from top to bottom and across the board. And I think that's a critical component of getting to the outcome that we want to achieve.
Thanks, Debbie. Narena?
I can't do just one.
30 seconds.
Bill, pass the infrastructure bill, pass comprehensive immigration reform to address our labor shortages. And also, I would say that implement the qualified mortgage proposal that was released, or the final rule that was released last year at the CFPB to expand access to credit.
Thanks. Kimberly?
Wow, I think I agree with everyone, but I'm going to go with affordable housing, because we can do all the work around policy, which we do need, counseling, which we do need. We can do everything, but if we don't create an affordable housing, there's going to be no place to house, right? They're going to be priced out of the market. So I think affordable housing, I think supply is truly important, but policy probably is second, because, got to go back to that root cause of all this.
Okay. And Stockton, 30 seconds.
A comprehensive national strategy on affordable home building and apartment construction that looks not just at the housing system and subsidies, but manufacturing, trade, and immigration policy with the lens of racial equity.
Thank you. That was good. You guys are good with the 30 seconds. So I want to transition over to the audience Q&A. We have a ton of questions in the Q&A box. I'm just going to sort of go through randomly. Also, June and Lori, thank you for turning your cameras back on, because some of these questions will probably be geared to you as well. So let's see. Oh, actually, Lori, I'm going to ask you and June potentially to ask this question, because I think it might be clarifying, and it was one of the first questions we got in. Why does homeownership have such a greater weight for wealth building for African Americans than it does for whites when it comes to wealth building?
Because African Americans have much less in other types of wealth. So even though they are the absolute wealth of Black homeowners is lower than it is of white homeowners, a much greater proportion of that is in housing wealth. Housing wealth is actually the most democratized of the types of wealth, and that's why it's so important to make sure that everybody has that opportunity, assuming that they can afford it.
And I can add some numbers here. That is, as of 2019, the net worth. So when we calculate the net worth, this is basically something liquid you can use. The average median net worth, the median net worth for the homeowners, U.S. homeowners, is about 254,000, and 47% of that net worth, or I can put the number here, which is 120,000, is actually come from home equity. So, a huge portion of the net worth is home equity. And if you take a look at the numbers for households of color, Blacks, Hispanic, Asian, and others, the number is more astonishing. The share of the home equity, within the net worth is much higher than 50%. So that's why we think that, houses is definitely a wealth building tool, a very, very useful tool, especially for the households of color.
Thank you, June. There's another question about the housing bubble and how the housing bubble and the resulting crash played meaningfully into the trends that we're seeing between 2000 and 2020. Lori, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So you had a lot of people who lost their home, which obviously, so let's say you were 25 to 34 in 2010, you lost your home. chances are good that you're not going to be able to, chances are good that if your credit score is low and that you're not going to be able to get back into home ownership, although some people do, relatively few. And that carries through for a lifetime, because if you weren't able to access home ownership, home prices keep going up. It becomes ever harder to do. So you look at the groups that were the most impacted. If you actually broke it, we showed that we broke out the 45 to 64-year-olds. It was actually 45 to it was actually 45 to 74-year-olds, you know, in 2040, and you look at where they were, those were the 15 to 45-year-olds in 2010, those that were most impacted by the great financial crisis. So losing your home or losing your job and not being able to access home ownership early on carries through during your entire life and puts you in a less good position for retirement, for old age, etc.
Thanks, Lori. Debbie, I want to, there's a great question in the chat that I want to pose to you. Any thoughts on how to target racial discrepancies given fair housing laws that now prohibit focusing on Black, Indigenous, people of color households? We get that question a lot too when we talk about targeting. So that's a great question from Ashley Johnson that I wanted to pose to you.
Sure. So let me talk about two things really quickly. One is the special purpose credit programs that I mentioned earlier. So this is actually a provision of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act that allows for the creation of programs targeted to people who otherwise would not qualify or would qualify on less favorable terms for credit. It's not limited to mortgages, but can be used for mortgages, which means that you could create a program with some of the things that folks have talked about, right? Lower down payment requirements, lower credit score requirements, more flexible underwriting in one way or another. And you can, under the provisions of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act and Regulation B, which implements it, you can require that people who get access to that program share some common characteristic, which can be race, gender, ethnicity, etc. Right? And I mean, there's some, you have to set the foundation for it. There's some steps you have to go through to show that that's a need, but it is something that we can do. And then on the down payment side, and actually we're seeing this a tiny bit in the homeowner assistance fund as well, which maybe we'll come back to in another question. But we've been talking to folks at Urban and elsewhere over the last months about the possibility of creating a down payment assistance program that is actually race conscious. So again, there's some steps that you have to go through to get there. It's a concept that we've never really used in the housing world before, but we've used it in other places, right? The Small Business Administration has programs that are targeted to what are called socially and economically disadvantaged people. It's basically race conscious. The Department of Transportation has that. The USDA has a socially disadvantaged renters and farmers program. What we need to do is to demonstrate the government's compelling interest in having that kind of program based on our history of discrimination in housing, which has disadvantaged people of color from becoming and sustaining home ownership. I think it's something that we can do. We're not there yet. And, again, if you follow the rules, basically, you can do it in a way that's completely consistent with the Fair Housing Act and other civil rights laws.
Thank you, Debbie. I appreciate that. Narena, maybe I will pose this question to you because I think you talked a little bit about sort of supply, on the supply side, about contractor issues and labor issues. I think you might have raised this. Wesley Williams has a comment/question. A supply side issue is constrained by the lack of minority or people of color in construction and the development space. This is partially due to the lack of financing for businesses of color. What policies could be introduced to truly make an effective change on that issue?
Well, I think that's broader. I think small business grants and supports in general. But we actually found that in terms of the labor supply issue, the sectors within the home building process that have the most acute labor shortages are those with immigrant labor, are those that have high percentages of immigrant labor, high percentage of communities of color that are in those sectors. But if you're talking about just ownership of construction and home builder industry, I think that's a broader conversation based on supports that we can give through the Small Business Administration and so forth. But I do think that there needs to be a concerted effort as a country, that this is, we're at crisis levels and we need to do something about it. And I think it's all hands on deck on everything that we can do on that issue.
Thank you. Lori, maybe I'll pose this question to you. There's actually a couple of questions in the Q&A box about the issue. Another issue is not just homeownership, but the devaluing or undervaluing of properties on the appraisal side. I know Urban has done some work around this as well, but I wonder if you could sort of speak to the concerns about if you're even trying to do wealth building with homeownership, but our properties are undervalued, how do you address that issue?
Yeah, so I think there's sort of two separate issues. There's the valuation issue and there's the appraisal issue, and it's very important to separate them. When you look at like automated valuation models, Michael Neal and several co-authors did a very recent study showing that there's a bigger error rate in terms of valuation of Black homes because they're valued lower. They're valued. So that's not an appraisal. There's not an appraisal bias issue per se. It's that the homes are valued lower. And in order to get the values up, you need to make investments in the communities to raise the value of the communities. That said, the age at which you buy a home is also a key variable in terms of your ability to build wealth. The earlier you're able to buy that home, the earlier you can begin to build wealth. And what you tend to find is that Black homeowners tend to buy later than their white counterparts because they don't have the necessary down payment or credit score to buy same proportion as at the same age, and the terminal home ownership is much lower. So I think age plays a very important role as well.
There's another question, and maybe I will pose this to, I'll ask Leanne to weigh in, as well as Norena and Stockton. And it says, how can, in general, we promote racial equity in homeownership, given the challenges and restrictions at the policy level? What can occur at other levels in the housing industry among real estate professionals, et cetera? Leanne?
Sure, it's a great question. So I mentioned investment in community development financial institutions. So across our network, we have a number of those that originate first mortgages and down payment assistance. A solid third of the mortgages that they do are to people with credit scores under 670. So it can be done. You can make these investments. You can work with your borrowers. You can invest in them. They take different risks than banks do in financial institutions. They also have found success by partnering locally with real estate agents, with different groups that represent the community in order to, whether it's churches or other partners locally, to kind of connect with the populations, the minority population, or whoever it is that they're wanting to serve. So there are strategic ways through relationship building and investing in the homebuyer preparedness that you can achieve this at a local level. But we do need more investment to make that happen. Thanks.
Norena?
So in the absence of policies, given the realities that we're seeing about who the future of the housing industry, I think the real estate industry in general, from the lending industry to the real estate industry, needs to be reflective of the individuals that are buying and purchasing homes at all level of decision making. So not just at the point of sale, but also in the C-suites. The decision makers that understand the nuances of these new these new communities that are buying home. I want to point you to an amazing quote that someone we interviewed said. She said, "My team's processor, for example, is a Latina with 20+ years of processing experience who grew up in our industry with her dad being a Latino realtor. She understands the dynamics of multi-generational households, as well as families joining together to purchase their first home, 2 households under one roof. She also has an understanding of cash deposits that derive from stashing cash at home and from undocumented employment to bring in extra cash. I don't have to try to sell her on my underwriters on why home buyers or older Latino couple made a decision to save $20,000 in cash at home over the last 8 years due to mistrust of the banking system from past experiences from their homeland. So it's little nuances like that having people who truly understand the nuances of the community makes all the difference.
Yeah, thank you, Narena. I love that point. I cannot believe it, but we have managed to get to the end of our time together. It feels like the time flew by. I want to take a moment to just thank the presenters, Lori and June, for an incredibly insightful and informative presentation. And I want to thank the panelists, Leanne, Debbie, Narena, Kimberly, and Stockton, for your incredible insights and recommendations, and just giving us a lot of food for thought to think about in terms of how to address the issue, because none of us on this panel, and hopefully none of the participants who are attending, believe that this is inevitable. There is an opportunity to make change, and we really appreciate your insights today. And I want to thank everyone who attended this amazing presentation and conversation. Thank you so much for everyone who joins us, and thank you again to the presenters.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.